Good morning. Good morning. Good morning to the NYU Nation, NYU Law School. Welcome back to all of you who are celebrating your reunion year. I was pleased to celebrate mine last year, and I know it's fun to come back and get together with classmates to reflect on the world, to see how many of the lessons that you learned when you were here still apply, and a good time to refresh ourselves and to dig down into the topics of the day. I am Debo Adegbile, a graduate of the class of 1994, and I'm delighted to be with you here today. And the principal reason I'm so delighted is because I'm here with my good friend and noted scholar, Deborah Archer, NYU's own. Many of you probably know that Deborah is the Margaret B. Hoppin Professor of Clinical Law at NYU. She's also the founding director of the Community Equity Initiative and the director of the Civil Rights Clinic. And so Deborah keeps busy. And for most people, that would be enough, perhaps too much. But Deborah doesn't stop there. And so she's also chair of the board of the ACLU in her spare time, helping to lead that little-known legal organization that occasionally finds itself in the type of good trouble that John Lewis charged us all to get involved in. And so it's a real treat to be here with Deborah. Deborah and I have known each other for some time. She was smart enough to leave the NAACP Legal Defense Fund just before I got there. I've managed not to take that personally over the years, but I think she was the last person to leave before I got to LDF and worked there for a number of years. And I now am a partner at the WilmerHale law firm. And so that's a little bit about Deborah's titles. And we're here today, of course, to speak about her wonderful contribution to legal scholarship and the story of our nation, Dividing Lines, how transportation infrastructure reinforces racial inequality. That's what brought all of you here on this somewhat dreary spring day, but we're gonna liven it up a bit. And we've heard a bit about Deborah's titles, but I think that where I'd like to start our conversation today is to ask Deborah to speak a little bit to the formative influences that led her to her career path and to do these things that she does, and why those commitments are so strong for you, and in turn, why they led you to focus on this topic.
Okay. Well, thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you all for joining us. You all should know that I am a little afraid because I've been in conversations with Davo before, and I don't know what he is going to ask, and we haven't locked it down, so I'm a little anxious about what's to come, but it's a good start. I'm good with the first question. So as he mentioned, I am a member of the faculty here, and I think it's interesting to tell my story because my background is not what you would consider as standard for folks who are on the faculty here. I am the first person in my family to graduate from college, and I'm a first-generation American citizen. And so I came to do this work because I wanted to fight for people like me and families like my own and our ability to live with dignity and respect. I grew up in Connecticut, as many people know, one of the richest states in the country. But because my parents were immigrants, because they didn't have a chance to go to college, because they spoke with accents, and because of the color of their skin, they really struggled financially. And they raised us at first in Hartford, Connecticut, which is a predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood. And while we were living in Hartford, we experienced all of the things that come with being in a community that has been blocked off from access to all the tools that so many of us take for granted in terms of our ability to live healthy, happy, and choice-filled lives. And so we were surrounded by a highway that kind of kept us feeling blocked in physically and psychologically. It contributed to pollution and noise. We had major roadways that raced through our community that also made it unsafe. All of these things made it hard to get economic investment in our communities, businesses, mortgages for homes, and all of those things. And it also made it difficult to leave, to access the economic opportunities in the suburbs, because buses didn't want to run between the suburbs and Hartford. They wanted to make sure that folks felt locked in. My parents decided to move us out so that I could attend better schools and live in a safer neighborhood. And they got us to Windsor, Connecticut, but then faced all of the both physical and invisible ways that we lock people in place. When we got to Windsor, we were one of 3 Black families in our community. And the folks who lived there wanted to make sure they reminded us every time that they could that we weren't wanted, that this wasn't a place for us. And I remember being 10 years old and waking up to find out that our house had been vandalized and KKK had been spray painted on our car and our home. And at that point, I was 10 and my brother was 7. And they had to explain to us really why our neighbors didn't want us there, who the KKK was. And we just kind of lost the sense of safety that we had in that home. It was no longer a special place. It wasn't a place where I felt safe playing in our yard or in the park or even going to school. And so very early on, I got down this path where I was focused on all of the ways that we embed inequality at the intersections of race and space, the way that we talk about good communities versus bad communities as if they're natural and inevitable, and don't really dig into the things that we do to create good and bad communities and then to keep people in those communities and deny them access to opportunities. And I think both of us would say that the majority of the work that we have done to challenge this kind of inequality focuses on the invisible tools, the federal, state, and local laws and policies and practices like redlining or racial covenants, explicitly racially discriminatory laws that keep people separate, keep us away from opportunity. But what I'm trying to do in Dividing Lines is explore the physical ways, right? Our communities also include physical boundaries and lines that keep us apart, that destroy, divide, and oppress. And one of those tools is our nation's transportation infrastructure. And it has historically and today been used as a tool of oppression and division.
Well, thanks, Deborah. I think that's an important grounding and tells us a little bit about how you found your way to this topic. And as I think about the book and as I began to dig into it, I thought to myself, in some ways, Dividing Lines is a story about the persistence, adaptability, and reach of the Jim Crow system. And that seems to be one of the themes that runs through the book. And so I'm wondering if you could elaborate on those points. How is it that it tells us something about that system?
Yeah, so I agree with you 100%. And one of the powers of racism rests in its ability to adapt and evolve and find its way into the spaces that we leave for it to evolve into. So, America passes the 15th Amendment and says black men are allowed to vote, and then America responds with poll taxes and voter purges. America says that separate but equal is not legal, and then we respond with all different ways that we separate, divide folks. America says we can't enslave people, and then we respond with all the different ways that we have re-enslaved or perpetuated the degradation of our slavery system into other systems. And so I have found through my research that transportation infrastructure was one of those tools. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that as we saw the victories of the 1950s and 1960s of the civil rights movement start to rack up, and we also saw the development of more positive civil rights laws, states and localities around the country turned to infrastructure as a more durable, more visible tool that would withstand the evolution of civil rights laws. A specific example connects Brown versus Board of Education, which I'm sure everybody in here knows and learned about in your con law class, in our interstate highway system. So Brown versus Board of Education came down in 1954, declared separate educational facilities by race could never be equal. And more than signaling the fall of racial segregation in education, it was taken as a signal that segregation writ large was going to start to fall around the country. Folks in the South and also in other places around the country responded by saying, we're going to do everything we can to protect our way of life. We are going to hold on. We will make sacrifices. We will use every tool to hold on to segregation. So Brown is in 1954. 1956, we see the passage of the Interstate Highway Act. And rather than build the interstate highway system against the promise of Brown and using it as this tool to connect us all, and it really did have a powerful way of connecting people, and it was a driver of economic opportunity for so many, but not for everyone. Rather than leaning into that potential, instead it was used as a tool to divide. One of the examples I talk about is Birmingham, Alabama. And Birmingham during this period was known as Bombingham because as black folks were able to leave the confines of their segregated communities and move into formerly segregated white communities, the response was to bomb their houses. And there were so many house bombings that Birmingham became known by this name. One of the tools that they used was racial zoning laws. And so a racial zoning law would say, here's a zone, and this zone here is where black people could live. And in this zone over here is where white folks would live. And you're not allowed to buy houses and live in a zone that's not designated for your race. So the Supreme Court struck that down. And then Birmingham, led by notorious segregationist Bull Connor, built the highway in a way that reinforced those invisible lines with physical lines. And if you overlay the racial zoning maps of Birmingham, Alabama, with the highway, they mirror each other. They built the highway on the exact lines that the racial zoning boundaries were to lock in that segregation, to destroy black communities and be a physical divider. Also looked at Atlanta, and I-20 did something similar. Atlanta had racial zoning laws. I-20 is built on some of those same racial zoning law boundaries. But I-20 also has other loops and curves that people found interesting. When I dug into it, I found evidence, just outright statements, admissions, that the mayor of Atlanta at the time promised the white community that he was going to build the highways along these boundaries to give them a barrier, to be a line of demarcation, to be that barrier for them. And when people came and said, you should switch it a little bit, this doesn't make any sense, he said, no, I can't, because I promised this community that I would protect them from black migration, so it has to stay where it is. And then another example I talk about is in Indianapolis, Indiana. And what they used was redlining. And I know that folks know what redlining is. You're literally drawing red lines around communities and saying they're not worthy of economic investment. We're not going to give you a mortgage to buy a house there. We're not going to give you a loan to repair your house. We're not going to give you a loan to start a business in these particular communities. And the result is decades of economic deprivation that has an impact on those communities. So when Indianapolis was going to build I-65 and I-70, which intersect in downtown Indianapolis, they built it right through predominantly black and Jewish communities that had been redlined. And when you overlay the redlining map with the highway intersection map, the highway only goes through redlined communities. And it may give us the impression, and I think the narrative that comes out of the building of the interstate highway system gives us the impression that we just removed and destroyed blighted communities that should have been removed, that were subpar and were struggling. And it's just not true. When you look at the history, these were really vibrant communities, the center of cultural life in black communities. Some of them were the center of the music scene. In Miami, Overtown was destroyed by I-95, and Overtown was considered to be the Harlem of the South and was a really vibrant and economic community. Middle-class folks lost their homes. And you all know that home ownership is the core of our wealth. And so when folks lost their homes in massive numbers, we destroyed the economic core of those communities and of those families. And then folks had to move to already deeply segregated communities and find homes there in communities that were already stretched to provide for those who live there. So while the highways connected white folks who were living in the growing suburbs with economic opportunity in the cities and in urban areas, black and brown folks weren't allowed to live in those suburbs. And they had to find new homes in neglected and divided communities. So that's just the highway. The books talk about other aspects as well, but I don't know if you want me to go there yet. I'm going to follow your lead.
Well, I think that's a pretty powerful demonstration. As we look back, though, at that bill, I'm thinking about this theme of adaptability and persistence of discrimination. And essentially what you've explained is that there was this infrastructure bill, and then because of the time we were in certain places, it was used and deployed in particular ways that re-entrenched the system that had fallen, or at least some of the pillars of the system had fallen, if not the system itself. So as we think about it, is there a lesson? Was the bill wrong? Was it the bill that was a problem? Or was any bill that was passed at that time going to be molded by these external forces that were at play?
Yeah, I don't know that it was the bill itself, although years later, after we started to see the devastation in the 50s and 60s and there were highway revolts, we saw Congress pass laws to kind of modify the worst harms, right? To provide some relocation assistance to protect environmentally kind of sensitive places. But all the kind of corrections didn't address race. And I think that there's probably nothing they could have done because we're going to use, kind of white supremacy is going to use the tools to reinforce itself, to protect itself, and we'll use those tools and adapt the tools we have. So I don't think there was anything in the language of that law itself. It really is the surrounding legal ecosystem that it exists in, where courts are not going to protect black and brown communities, where we believe that black and brown communities politically are the path of least resistance, where we're always looking for a smoking gun of racial discrimination, and that's just not how infrastructure decisions are often made. Or I saw during my research, particularly in this case, that LDF brought, challenging destruction of many communities in Nashville. The courts are going to bend over backwards to kind of validate the justifications that government officials give as the reasons for what they're doing. And when you step outside of the Highway Act context and look at some of the ways our roads and street grids have evolved to lock in inequality, you see that it really isn't about the language of a particular bill, is about a motivation. And so after we saw the Interstate Highway Act do all that it did to black and brown communities, we saw that road planners, urban planners, adopted very traditional, on their own, non-objectable ways that they also locked in segregation and inequality. So an example is Atlanta. Atlanta did the highways. Atlanta did so much more. They're a creative group of people down there. At the time, they called themselves the city that was too busy to hate, but they certainly made time, and their roads reflect that. So Atlanta used one-way streets. After the communities were segregated, they had a series of one-way streets that only would lead from away from white communities and towards black communities, making it hard to get from a black community to a white community. And it's still that way, and it makes it really difficult to get around Atlanta. Atlanta would turn through streets into cul-de-sacs or just block them off with literal walls to stop folks from traveling through. One example I talk about in the book is the Peyton Road Wall, or what became known as Atlanta's Berlin Wall. And after a black surgeon who was a graduate of Morehouse, where my youngest goes to school now, decided to buy a house in a white community, the white community said, no more. You've got to help us. And the mayor instructed folks to build a wall that blocked off the main road that led from the black community to the white community, and just built a road right in the middle of it. And that road stood for about 70 days until litigation was filed and was able to get that wall torn down. But it really just signaled to people around the country and to folks in Atlanta that you could use tools like this. Atlanta also stopped paving roads. The road would be paved in the white community, and then it would become a dirt road in the black community. And then Atlanta used street names. If you look at the Atlanta's street map, they wanted to spare white folks the indignity of even living on the same street as black folks, even though they lived on the same street. And so as streets moved from a white community to a black community, or from a black community to a white community, they would change the name. And one of the lines of demarcation was Ponce de Leon Boulevard. And so if you look, on one side of Ponce, the street has one name, and then the other side of Ponce, it has another name. And so none of that is about the language that enables street naming or how we talk about the use of one-way streets or cul-de-sacs or any of that. That is, again, about the way that those who love yesterday are going to fight against tomorrow. They're going to use every tool that they can. And our transportation infrastructure and transportation policy is an available tool because we don't think about it in the context of race and inequality, even though we really should, because it's hard to separate discussions about transportation and race. They're so linked. We think about slavery and the way that we used transportation as a way to enforce and lock in slavery, because kind of a foundation of white supremacy then and today is to make black people understand their place socially. And then what better way to help people stay in their place socially than to keep them in their place physically? And so we saw transportation being controlled in ways that limited movement. And then I know we all know about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott and freedom riders. And folks like John Lewis, who you mentioned earlier, who marched over bridges, over the Edmund Pettus Bridge to demand freedom. So you can't really tell stories about this country's second Reconstruction without talking about transportation. But we now kind of have forgotten that and just view transportation as a way to get from point A to point B, when really transportation is the infrastructure of everything that we all value and hold dear. Transportation is the infrastructure of a vibrant democracy. It's the infrastructure of equitable education. It's the infrastructure of good health and access to economic opportunity. And those of us who care about justice in those areas, those of us who care about equality, tend to forget that. But those who are trying to fight against access to education and access to health care and economic opportunity, who want to undermine our democracy, all know the power of transportation. And so I'm hoping that my research in this book is really going to help us shift the way we think about transportation and how it is a tool for building more equitable, sustainable communities.
Deborah, I think that's one of the real contributions of this book, because I think so many of us don't think about transportation in a larger way. We think about it in terms of being an instrumentality that we use, how we get from point A to point B, how we travel around to see our relatives or do our jobs, what's the best route to get somewhere, how are kids getting to school. We think about it in sort of a narrow way. But one of the contributions of this book is that you connect the roads and the system in a way that connects to the social history and racial history of the United States. But let's take up one argument that a skeptic might put on the table.
Okay.
And I'm always very skeptical of you.
Here we go.
And as you know.
That's why I left LDF before you got there. I knew you were coming.
So, fair enough. So much so she just decamped and went to the ACLU. She said, I'm going to keep going. But how about this idea that if somebody is training their eye on the transportation system and how highways and roads evolved, what if they say, look, there's also an economic answer to this. There's an answer that is the road of least resistance, and very often you're building the roads through the lowest value properties and the communities with takings and the like that has the path of least resistance, and that it's a rational move to build the roads in that way, to build the highways in that way, rather than building it through Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue, or Main Street. What about that?
Yeah, no, I certainly hear that argument and see that, right? It is the path of least resistance politically. And if you're going to use eminent domain to build infrastructure, the idea is to find the cheapest land. But we have to think about what we have done to cause Black and brown communities to be the path of least resistance politically. And it's connected to a history of undermining political strength in those communities and ongoing voting rights discrimination. And why is it cheapest? One, we still, as a country, value the lives, the homes, the lands, the communities that are occupied by Black and brown folks less than we value the communities that you're talking about. And we use tools intentionally to undermine the strength of those communities. We just talked about redlining. And so a lot of these communities are the way that they are because of our policies around redlining. And then I mentioned racial zoning laws. Of course, when they were designating zones for non-white people, it was in the least desirable areas and neighborhoods. They would put Black and brown neighborhoods in areas that were prone to flooding. And then those communities flooded, and we don't do anything to protect them and to save them. And this is really shifting us a little bit, but it brings me to a current case that my clinic is working on here. And we represent a community in Centerville, Illinois, a predominantly Black community that is surrounded by a predominantly white county. And the folks in Centerville, for decades, their water infrastructure has been neglected. For decades. They don't have proper water management in any sense. No sewer, water management, nothing. Although it's been built up in the community, in the areas around them. And decade after decade, their homes would flood. At this point, if it rains for 5 minutes, that community floods with water. Their houses fill with raw sewage. They have feces baked into their walls because it just is happening over and over again, and no one is helping them over the course of decades, not repairing it, not helping them repair their homes. And this is a really low-income community. They can't afford to keep making these kinds of repairs on their homes. So after one of the most recent floods, the federal government declared that it was a disaster area and they were eligible for a federal buyout program. And the county said, there you go. We're going to buy out your homes. You all can move out. We'll tear them down, and then we don't have to fix the water infrastructure. But because of the decades of neglect at the hands of this county and the state government, and because the folks there were not able to fund their own repairs for all this damage, they're only being offered $5,000 for their homes. Because they're like, your home is damaged. Your roof is, your foundation is crumbling and your roof is not right. And so you're going to get $5,000. They're trying to turn this community of Black homeowners into renters who can't even afford to rent in this neighborhood anymore. And the excuse is, well, your property is not of high value. That is the value of your home. That's the value of this property because it floods all the time. But not thinking about the fact that they caused this flooding. They built this community in this way and didn't provide them the resources to defend their own homes, to defend this community. And I feel similarly around transportation infrastructure. We have created Black and brown communities that have been sacrifice zones. We put the highways through them, then we put these major roadways through them, and then we brought in waste transfer facilities, and then we put the dump in there, and then we built the train station, and we did all of this. And now we say, well, we have to build new roads. We have to expand. We need to modernize our system. And we need to go where the land is the cheapest. And you already got a whole lot of stuff. Your air quality is already bad. You already are prone to flooding. We might as well put the highway there, put the road there, because we don't want to take these other $1 million homes. But again, as I said earlier, We talk about good and bad neighborhoods and act as if it's natural. We created them, and we cannot use that as a justification to continue to force certain communities to bear all of the negatives of the infrastructure that we all need, to force them to deal with the loss of property and the damage to air quality and noise, and then allow a different community to access all the benefits, having never borne any of the burden.
Very, very important observations. As we think about this story, and you've spoken about the invisible lines that divide us. Sometimes the motivations in this space are not so invisible, as you mentioned. You told the story of the politicians that were building walls and placing the highway on certain lines and couldn't move it because of promises they had made. And I think that there is a tendency in America to sort of try and cabin the story of race in America to the 1950s and 60s, and to think about everything that happened thereafter as being sort of extra work that's being done, and that the problem stopped, and now we need to just go on. In the Obama era, one of the things we heard a lot was post-racial America. When's the last time you heard about how post-racial America is, right, with the ascendancy of Barack Obama? But in that period, it was very powerful rhetoric, right, because he had ascended to this high office, and John Lewis often said that he thought that America was preparing to lay down the burdens of race. I think as time went on, he became less convinced that we were at that place. But I wanted to ask about a moment that these sentiments came to be highlighted and underlined by some political leaders. And I'm struck by the story of Newt Gingrich in 1994 speaking about buses. And the reason that that's important is perhaps busing and buses are one of the ways in which I think we all understand transportation and race, because it's been such an integral part of the school desegregation story. And so it's one way in which transportation is something that everybody that goes to law school has learned about at some point. But what was Newt Gingrich's take on bus lines and buses in 1994?
So I talk about, and I, as an aside, I can hear all the folks who have sparkling water opening it up, because it's been like a rash of exploding sparkling water bottles at the law school this week. So I can hear y'all. So anyone who has a sparkling water bottle, you might want to just do it right now. We can all do it together, and have the explosions all happen at once. See, I told you. See, y'all thought I was lying. Anyway, so I talk about buses in the context of public transportation, because that is another system that has been used to lock in, perpetuate inequality. Really, public transportation helps to parcel access to jobs and healthcare, to school. I tell one story, I talk about one study that's a lot of the health disparities that we see in Black and brown communities can be connected to lack of access to public transportation to get you to the doctor. Because if you have to take 2 buses and a train, and it's going to take you 2 hours each way to get to the doctor, you probably aren't going to go unless it's an emergency. And so public transportation kind of follow the evolution that you're talking about, starting from explicit racism, but now evolving to the use of dog whistles, and kind of the guise of safety, but really leaning into this narrative of excessive Black criminality. And within public transportation, buses are the least welcome tool, because they're predominantly used by Black and Latino folks. And so Newt Gingrich in 1994 was working with folks in Cobb County to support them to block the MARTA from having a bus that came from Atlanta into Cobb County. And he said, people in Cobb County don't object to upper middle class neighbors who keep their lawn cut and move to the area to avoid crime. What people worry about is the bus line gradually destroying one apartment complex after another, bringing people out from public housing who have no middle class values and whose kids, as they become teenagers, often are centers of robbery and where the schools collapse because the parents who live in the apartment complexes don't care that the kids don't do well in school, and the whole school system collapses. And he didn't say anything about race explicitly, but that was all about race. And that's the way we see public transportation and buses evolve. There's a more explicit link to busing that I was interested in that I didn't get a chance to explore in this book. But some of the justifications to avoid busing for school desegregation were the highways. And so the highway would divide a black community on one side and a white community on the other, and their schools were there, so it would have been easy to integrate those schools. But the claim was that because the highway was there, the bus would have to drive all the way around. It would make the route too long, and therefore they could not integrate those schools, and they could not use busing to integrate those schools. But today I was able to find a few examples that I would love to share around the way we're currently using busing as a tool of discrimination. I was able to find a story about a woman named Cynthia, a young woman named Cynthia in Buffalo, 17 years old, black woman, lived in an urban area of Buffalo, but worked in an upscale suburban mall and would take the bus to work. But the upscale suburban mall would not let city buses into the parking lot. Let commuter buses, let tour buses, but not the city bus. And so she had to race across 7 lanes of traffic to get from the bus stop to the mall across the street. And one day as she was making that run across the street, she was struck by a truck and killed. And that example is just one tragic example of a story that repeats around the country, where black and brown folks are living in urban areas trying to access economic opportunity in the suburbs using public transportation, and they're blocked from doing that. I spent quite a bit of time with some community members, organizers, and advocates from who worked on a case in Beaver Creek, Ohio. And Beaver Creek is a suburb of Dayton. And again, the folks in Dayton want to get to Beaver Creek because they have an upscale mall and there are jobs there, and so they work there. But Beaver Creek won't let bus stops within Beaver Creek. And so the folks who are coming from Dayton get to the closest bus stop and then have to walk about 2 miles from that bus stop to the mall. And half of that route is over a highway within a highway overpass where there's no sidewalk, there's no traffic calming measures because it's not meant for pedestrians, but that's the way that they get to walk to the mall. The community organized and was able to convince the Regional Transportation Authority to try to help them get a bus stop. Regional Transportation Authority goes to the Beaver Creek city officials and say, we need a bus stop. They say no. They were like, no, you really do need to have some bus stops. And they say, we're not going to do bus stops because we don't want our mall turning into the Dayton Mall, which is the mall where black and brown folks shopped. And we have a responsibility to the safety of our citizens. And so we need to do everything to protect the safety of people who live in Beaver Creek and who elected us. So the Regional Transportation Authority was able to get the Federal Department of Transportation involved. And the Federal Department of Transportation comes in and says, you all are really going to build some bus stops because this is racist. It violates Title VI, and you need to build these bus stops. And Beaver Creek, after lots of resistance, says, fine, we'll build some bus stops. But first, we have some conditions. Condition number 1, at every bus stop, there needs to be 24-hour closed circuit feed directly into the police department. And no other bus stops had that. 2, you have to build an 18-foot concrete pad. And that kind of concrete pad is equivalent to what you would have if a plane was landing, not if a bus was landing, was stopping. And 3rd, every bus shelter had to be fully air-conditioned and heated. And at that point, the only fully air-conditioned bus shelter in the world was in Dubai. And so they, again, didn't use race explicitly, but it was about this narrative of black criminality. It was about the guise of safety. And they used seemingly neutral requests to keep the bus stop out. Luckily, in Beaver Creek, the Department of Transportation decided that they were going to use every tool that they had, and they were able to force the folks in Beaver Creek to add bus stops along that route. And nothing's changed about the Beaver Creek Mall. It's still high-end. It's still fancy. But now people can get to work more safely, and they don't have to walk 2 miles in the wind and the rain and the snow to get to work. And again, this story is a story. I talk about the book talk about examples in California, talk about Maryland, where they were fighting against the red line going into suburban communities because they didn't want folks in Baltimore to jump onto the red line, come to their communities, steal their televisions, and then get back on the train to head back to Baltimore. And so it is not just about explicit racism. It is about the ways that we use these narratives that are deeply embedded in kind of the racial narrative to facilitate this.
Are the bus stops air conditioned?
No, but we need to get air-conditioned bus stops in New York City because in August it is oppressive. Yeah.
That light rail story about Baltimore and Maryland. When was that, and who was involved in that?
Yes,
story?
LDF were the attorneys, and and Dabo, were you running LDF at that time?
No. I
Okay.
was just running around trying to be Deborah Archer. And was that during Governor Hogan's time?
It was. Yeah, no, it was very recent, and he stepped in and, as you know, shut down the expansion of the Red Line, despite having federal funds committed to funding the majority of that project.
And what was the reason? Why did he shut it down? What
money, but it wasn't money because, again, the federal government had years before already committed that money to it. But it really was about the resistance of the suburban community who saw now a partner in shutting down the expansion of this Red Line. But you might know more details from your time. Tell me more about it.
This is your show. I'm just visiting. So staying on politics for a second, and the way in which there's sort of a through line of political leaders understanding more about the levers of transportation and how it affects race. I guess President Biden had an infrastructure bill, and that bill, I think, tried to do some things to address some of the inequality in race in America and transportation. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah. So I think the infrastructure bill was really had a lot of power and potential to change things. Certainly the historic investment in Black and brown communities in our transportation infrastructure, but also in there was money for water infrastructure investment as well in school infrastructure. It really had the potential to be transformative. Also provided grants to communities that were trying to stitch themselves back together after they had been divided by highways, but also other transportation infrastructure, help them reconnect to economic centers that evolve without integrating them. And also talked about racial equity and racial justice as a goal. And I think just even the conversations that came out of that bill were powerful and important. But there were challenges with that bill. I think it's one thing to say that racial justice and racial equity is a goal. There wasn't anything in there to really enforce that. And in the end, they did not distribute the majority of that money to the communities that needed it. And now under this new administration, they have suspended the disbursement of all of those funds. They have suspended all of the provisions that focus on racial equity, that focus on environmental justice, anything that is diversity, equity, and inclusion related. And we have environmental laws that were also powerful tools for advocates to use to fight for more equity and justice in infrastructure. And they have suspended the portions of that are focused on racial justice as well.
So I think you've mentioned some cases in passing, but because we're at a law school and because we're back for our reunions, is there a favorite case? Is there a case of yours that best illustrates the nexus between race and transportation that people should look to, or that you would put in your syllabus if you were teaching students about this? Is there some case that really drives how these issues are connected?
I don't know if there's one case. I think there's a lot of cases that help us show pieces of this. One of the cases I talk about in the book and that I learned about in law school and that we know from our time at LDF is Memphis versus Green. And I hate that I'm doing this conversation with Dabo because he knows so much more about some of this stuff than me, and he's going to, if he's shaking his head, then I'm getting it right. I'm going to keep looking at his face to see if I'm getting it wrong. But Memphis versus Green involved one of those segregation walls. And so there were a black and white community, and the black community would drive right through the white community, this main road, to get to downtown, to get to a park to get to all the things that they needed to do. And the folks in the white community decided that it was time to shut that down. We're not going to let you do that anymore. And they petitioned and got their government to build a wall that blocked off that road. And so you could no longer drive from the black community through the white community on that road because they put a barricade up there. And that case went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said a couple things that were problematic that I think kind of typify the way that we view these transportation decisions. First, the Supreme Court said the place where they built the wall and them blocking you from their community has nothing to do with your race. It has to do with where you live. And in this country, right, they forgot that it's very hard to separate where you live from race because we are so deeply racially segregated. And then the Supreme Court said, and it's not that big of a deal. It is a slight inconvenience. You can still get to the park. You can still get to downtown, but you have to just drive around the white community. It's going to add like 15 minutes to your commute, and it's just fine. And they decided in favor of maintaining that wall. Luckily, Thurgood Marshall was on the court. He was able to get 2 other justices to side with him. But he said, one, made the point of the connections between race and where you live in the country. But he also said it's not just an inconvenience. If it's 15 minutes extra, if it's 10 minutes extra, if it's 5 minutes extra, it is really about your government, state-sponsored, state-sanctioned symbols that show that you are valued less, that your lives matter less, that you're so awful that we can't allow you to go into these spaces. And it was more about the mark, about the stigma that's attached to that community and the people that live there than anything else. And so I think that case to me really embodies some of the thinking that drive people to ignore the ways that infrastructure is locking in, creating, perpetuating, stamping inequality, and kind of just excusing things as an inconvenience, or you can still get to you still have access to the subway. You just need to take the bus 20 minutes over that way. You can still get to the mall. We're just saying your bus can't come into our parking lot. All of it's just a way that we dismiss the inequality so that we can keep doing things the way that we've been doing them.
That's such an important theme in civil rights, is the moment when courts are prepared to acknowledge the way in which race interacts with things, and then the moments in which they just paint a story that is completely divorced from
That's
race.
right.
I think it's connected in some ways to a controversy we've seen in the higher ed space. And so some of you may know that years ago, long before the Harvard ruling, there was a ruling in Texas that barred the consideration of race in college admissions. And the Texas legislature responded by adopting something called the Top 10% Plan that some of you may have heard of. The Top 10% Plan suggested that the top 10% of high school students from high schools around the state of Texas could gain admission to the UT system. The idea being that this was a race-neutral measure. It didn't involve race. We were just saying the top 10% from every high school can gain admission. Of course, because of the history of segregation and all of the things that Deborah has spoken about in Texas, it inherently would provide a degree of diversity in the UT system, because although the schools weren't isolated anymore by law, they weren't de jure segregated, they were racially isolated, and many of them were black high schools or Hispanic or Latinx high schools and the like. And so this for a long time had been defended as a race-neutral approach to bring diversity to the UT system. But then cases have been brought by Ed Blum and some of the folks that have attacked the Harvard case, suggesting that this is not race neutral,
right,
that you're doing it on purpose because you're trying to pursue diversity, and so your intent is to bring diversity to the UT system. So what before was heralded as race neutral, now in the current light of day is being assailed as being a different method of
Yeah,
achieving diversity.
right.
So these themes about when race has explanatory power, when it doesn't, is definitely a theme that I think your book very well highlights. So you don't stop with just a description in your book of how this has all played out. You have some pieces that sort of cast forward and think a little bit about how could we do this differently, or what might we do that's different. And as somebody that's toiled in the Voting Rights Act litigation fields, I was interested that it sort of seemed like a version of pre-clearance, right? Pre-clearance for transportation. The Voting Rights Act used to have a provision that some parts of the country that had long histories of voting discrimination needed to have their voting changes pre-approved before they could come into effect, to make sure that they didn't have a discriminatory purpose or effect. And we called that part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, or pre-clearance. So tell me about Deborah Archer's racial equity impact assessments in the context of transportation.
And so the power of the pre-clearance requirement was that you didn't have to guess what tool they were going to use. Whatever tool that they were going to come up with to perpetuate racial inequality in voting, they had to get that cleared. And so you didn't have to rely on individuals or organizations to bring a litigation to challenge a new provision after it's done the damage. You were able to stop it before the damage was done. And that's part of what we need in transportation infrastructure decisions, is to stop the decision or to pause the decision, to think about the impact that it's going to have before that decision is locked in and we've started to implement it. So broadly, I think we need a real shift and transformation in the way we think about infrastructure and how it can serve traditionally marginalized communities. And I don't know if you want to call it an anti-racist design, if you want to call it a community equity focused, a racial justice focus, but we really do need to take a step back and look at transportation in a way that connects all of these seemingly disparate and isolated decisions to common policies and practices that continually lead to some communities being asked to host the burdens and others getting the benefits. Part of the challenge with our current civil rights laws, and you would think that there are really powerful civil rights laws, beautiful, sweeping language, but they often apply after a decision has been made and have been locked in, and then you can challenge that decision and its implementation. But in transportation, we need to get ahead of it and shape the decisions before they've been made, before we have the power and force of the entire government infrastructure moving behind that decision. Our civil rights laws focus on intent. They want to find the bad apple. They want to find the smoking gun. And transportation decisions just aren't made that way. They're made by a collective of people who use terms like economic investment and revitalization and connectivity that seem innocuous, but come together in ways that enforce racial inequality. And so one idea that I float in the book is racial equity impact studies, requiring government agencies that are about to engage in an infrastructure project to affirmatively look at the racial impact, the racial and ethnic impact of their decision, so that they don't look at our current situation as a neutral baseline and then continue to burden disproportionately certain communities. And this would then also force them to explore alternatives that would have less of a disproportionate impact and would more equitably distribute the burdens. And if in the end they see all this and they still decide we're still going to build it anyway, then it becomes a tool for folks like me and like Dabo to sue them because they did all the work for us, right? They did all the studies. You've demonstrated the disparate impact. You knew what it was going to be, and you still chose to do it anyway. And that may make some of the litigation tools that we have more powerful.
Thanks, Deborah. Why don't we see if there are a couple of audience questions?
Yeah, very interesting. I wrote my senior thesis at college on transportation in Boston in the 60s.
Yeah.
So I appreciate this. My question is, there has been a talk about taking federal land, which is terra nullius, if you will, and using that for construction of new cities. Do you have any comments? You've got this racial impact, equitable impact study on that, but how would you design a transportation system in a place which is nowhere?
How would I design a transportation system in a place where it's nowhere?
Nowhere today.
Yeah, I tend to shy away from having, and I did this I resisted in this book as well as feeling like there was just this one solution, because I do think it is all politics is local, as they say. And so what the solution is to connect a new city that we're building that is nowhere depends on what the surrounding area looks like, right? So there are some places where they're saying we should just tear down all the highways. But I don't think that that's the solution everywhere, because for some rural communities, if we're going to build a city that is nowhere, the highway is still an important tool of connection. But maybe a highway isn't the solution if building the highway is going to have to divide and go through and destroy too many existing places. Connect a bus line may be the way to connect a brand new community, but it really depends on what's in that area, right? So it's a regional decision. You cannot make a decision based on what one city, one town, one community needs. It is about what all of the communities in that area, in that region need, and figuring out transportation solutions that respect all of the pieces of that puzzle and connect all of the folks in that community.
I'd like to bring, my question brings the question closer to home. I can think of two instances of racially motivated transportation choices in New York. One is the fact that the A train goes from 42nd Street to 125th. Mm-hmm. The other one is the East Side train line that is underground and then miraculously comes up above 96th Street. I wonder if you could comment on those from, I assume you don't cover them in your book, but as an historical perspective, and anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah.
Deborah, before you comment, can I just hit one cultural reference that picked up on your first example? There was a movie called The Brother from Another Planet. And in that movie, there was a scene on the A train, and Fisher Stevens is playing a character busking for money on the A train. And he says, "For my next magic trick, I'm going to make all the white people disappear." Train stops at 59th Street. Everybody gets off, and the train continues on. So, Brother from Another Planet.
Now we're all going to... I watched that like decades ago.
I wasn't born yet, but I just with Netflix, you know.
Do you see why I can't be on panels with him? So I don't explore a lot in my New York City in my book. I do look at New York City in terms of policing and the way that we police public transportation but don't police other forms of transportation. So quickly, if you look at it all as theft, if you park on a street in New York City and don't pay the meter that you're supposed to pay, that could be considered to be theft. And the response is that you get a parking ticket. It's $35. You could get 10 parking tickets and continue to park and get to pay at your leisure. But if you jump a turnstile in New York City or get on the bus and don't pay the fare, we invoke the police. And I think that has a lot to do with who uses each mode of transportation. And the same is true with the way that we design our subway system and our bus system, whether it goes above ground or underground, when it just stops completely. The fact that we've been fighting so long to get the Second Avenue subway line. There's racism, of course, because Robert Moses is in many ways the father of all of this and helped design so much of New York City's transportation infrastructure in the Bronx and in Brooklyn. And so if you really do start to pick apart New York City, there are stories that involve race that help you understand why things happen that way, why things are underground and then above ground, why there are trees in some places and no trees in other places.
One more question.
I was 12 years old when Brown versus Board of Ed came down, and my father had taught me about segregation as evil, etc. So I said to myself when I first learned about Brown, great, now segregation will be gone in a year. And it didn't quite happen that way. So what we see legally is that first there was an attack on de jure segregation. Then we went to an attack on de facto segregation. But de facto segregation is much more difficult for the reasons Deborah mentioned, because it's improvisational, and a new kind will spring up when the old one is struck down. And I think one of the significances of Deborah's book is that it points to this overall thing of improvisational racism, where the bigoted community invents on the moment all kinds of different ways to enforce racism. Now, racism and white supremacy are essentially emotional things. They have nothing to do with rationality. There's no way you could have talked to a segregationist of the 50s and 60s and said, this is wrong, you've got to change your ways. The only way it was done was by the force of the law. And unfortunately, the law has limitations. It's much easier for the law to get rid of de jure segregation than it is for the law to get rid of de facto, for the reasons Deborah mentioned. There are frequently rational reasons for a particular action. So you can say, oh, I'm not doing it for discriminatory, I'm doing it for practical reasons. So I think what we have to learn is overall, the law has its limits. And what we have with racism, white supremacy, etc., is an essential social malfunctioning. Now, the commitment of segregationists to racism is unfortunately very similar to the commitment of MAGA Republicans to Trump doctrines, because it's not a rational commitment, it's an irrational commitment. And somehow we have to take the examples that Deborah gives in her book, etc., and elevate that up to say, okay, that's a signal of how to deal with the overall problem. The overall problem is the racism, which finds all these different ways to enforce itself. And we've got to socially address racism rather than each individual symptom of it. And how you do that, I haven't the faintest idea.
Well, on that point, I think that all that needs to be said has been said. Racism in America is persistent and adaptive, but Deborah Archer is helping us figure out how we go forward. Dividing Lines, read it.